IB Bio, Ecology, Conservation, Option C, Part 10, examines the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. This movie is for higher level students only. Remember that while energy enters, flows through, and exits closed systems, matter continuously cycles within a closed system. The essential idea is soil cycles are subject to disruption. Here is the outline of the available movies for Ecology Conservation Option C. Use this outline to find the movie you need. This movie is focused right here. Here's an image you've seen before. The Earth as a closed system. Light, high-quality energy enters the system, is transformed into chemical energy by photosynthesis, flows through the system as chemical energy as the energy moves through the food webs, and leaves the system as heat. Matter, however, chemical elements, compounds, cycle among living organisms and the physical environment. The IB syllabus notes, in closed ecosystems, energy, but not matter, is exchanged with the surroundings. Having just stated this IB syllabus statement, I want to put forth this IB syllabus statement. Soil cycles are subject to disruption. I want you to keep it in the back of your mind as you examine nutrient cycles, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. This is the essential idea of the topic. Again, keeping the disruption of cycles in the background, let's review biogeochemical cycles. The generalized model for a biogeochemical cycle is given here. You can see the movement of chemical elements and compounds between living organisms and the physical environment, and these flows are relatively fast. You can also see the movement of chemical elements and compounds into and out of the lithosphere, the rigid outermost shell of our Earth. The movement of chemical elements and compounds into and out of material located at depth below the surface of the Earth is very slow. Here is another image of the generalized biogeochemical cycle. It's important to study this image. The geo or rock portion of the cycle is here on the right. You can see the movement of material into and out of the Earth. On the left, we can see molecules cycling back and forth between living organisms and the physical environment. You should get to know the storages and the fluxes that are stated here. Some should be familiar to you, such as erosion, photosynthesis, and respiration. You need to study this diagram to make sense of the relationships among the storages and the fluxes. For example, respiration, a flux, releases carbon dioxide to the air, a storage, from the organic to the inorganic, represented by this flux. Or this flux could represent the decomposition of a leaf into soil nitrogen. Photosynthesis results in the uptake of carbon dioxide by plants from the atmosphere, represented by this flux. Or this flux could represent the uptake of nitrogen by plants or phytoplankton from the inorganic to the organic. This is known as assimilation. Erosion should be familiar to you. Fossilization, as the process by which organic matter is stored as organic fossil fuels deep within the earth, should be familiar to you. The formation of sedimentary rock should be obvious to you. This flux is sometimes known as sedimentation or deposition. You need to know all of the terms associated with the fluxes shown here. Here is a specific IB syllabus statement related to the nitrogen cycle. Draw and label a diagram of the nitrogen cycle. In this image of the nitrogen cycle, I've started with a simple diagram. Stay focused. We have an atmospheric storage of nitrogen here. Here is a storage of nitrogen in plants, nitrogen storage in animals, and nitrogen storage in the soil. This storage here represents soil nitrogen. You can see it's a bit complicated. I'll get to it shortly. Here is the uptake of nitrogen by plants from the soil and the return of nitrogen to the soil upon death. The soil plays a big role in the nitrogen cycle. Follow closely, because the soil includes the decomposers and the bacteria that fix nitrogen from the air into ammonia. Let me point out a couple of things. There's no interaction of plants and animals with atmospheric nitrogen. Nitrogen becomes organic when plants take up nitrogen from the soil. Notice the simple cycle here. Plants absorb nitrogen from the soil, assimilate nitrogen into plant organic matter, proteins and nucleic acids. Nitrogen moves to consumers by consumption, feeding, and decomposers return nitrogen to the soil when plants and animals die. Now, bacteria make nitrogen available to the soil through a process known as nitrogen fixation. That can be seen here. This is important to know. Bacteria, known as rhizobium, have a mutualistic relationship with pea family plants, and the rhizobium fix nitrogen from the air into ammonia, making nitrogen available in the soil as ammonia or ammonium. Ammonia and ammonium are ultimately converted to nitrates. Plants absorb nitrates and ammonium and then assimilate that nitrogen into protein. Lastly, particularly in anaerobic or waterlogged soils, bacteria will return nitrogen to the atmosphere in a process known as denitrification. This model of the nitrogen cycle does not include any of the deeper sedimentary cycle for nitrogen. Nitrogen is stored deep in the earth, in rock, although this storage is not significantly large. Here we can see the nitrogen cycle with a touch of realism. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria both in the soil and rhizobium associated with the roots of legume plants, pea plants, add ammonium and ammonia to the soil. Decomposers, including both anaerobic and aerobic bacteria, decompose dead organic matter. Soil bacteria transform ammonium to nitrates, which are then taken up by plants. This is known as assimilation. And anaerobic bacteria transform nitrates back to nitrogen in the atmosphere. This is known as denitrification. Here are two relevant IB syllabus statements. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen to ammonia. Rhizobium associates with roots in a mutualistic relationship. Rhizobium fixes nitrogen from the air into ammonia. In this image of the nitrogen cycle, I've added the magnitude of the storages, and I've added the lithosphere portion of the cycle. You can see that some nitrogen is stored in rock and fossil fuel, but notice the large storage of atmospheric nitrogen gas. This should make sense to you because nitrogen gas makes up nearly 80% of the Earth's atmosphere. The atmospheric storage is larger than the storage found in the Earth's sediments. Now, industrial fixation is meant to be the application of industrially produced fertilizers to the soil by our agricultural practices. The application of nitrogen or phosphorus fertilizers to the soil is a disruption of the soil cycle of these nutrients. If the soil system is in equilibrium, the rate of nitrogen fixation and denitrification should be roughly equal, but with the addition of industrially produced fertilizers, soil nitrogen levels are increasing, and this is a disruption in soil nitrogen cycling. The addition of fertilizers to agricultural fields is resulting in pollution, especially of our waterways. Here is a photograph of root nodules with rhizobium bacteria within the nodules on soybean roots. Rhizobium bacteria fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into ammonia. Rhizobium associates with roots in a mutualistic relationship. Rhizobium fixes nitrogen from the air into ammonia, providing nitrogen to the plants. In turn, the plants provide sugars and other organic molecules to the bacteria. Rhizobium bacteria infect the root of the pea plant, and over time, a nodule develops. The relationship between rhizobium and the plant is mutualistic. Both species benefit. Rhizobium fixes nitrogen from the air into ammonia, providing fixed nitrogen to the plant. The plant provides sugars to the bacteria, for the purposes of respiration. Here are two additional relevant IB syllabus statements. In the absence of oxygen, denitrifying bacteria reduce the nitrate in the soil. Insectivorous plants are adapted for low nitrogen availability in waterlogged soils. Waterlogged soils, as we can see in this image, occur because of poor drainage or because of over-irrigation. Waterlogged soils are anaerobic, and the low oxygen content of the soil increases the rate of nitrate loss from the soil in a process known as denitrification. Insectivorous plants, seen here, are adapted for low nitrogen availability in waterlogged soils. These plants do well in anaerobic, waterlogged soils because they supplement their requirement for nitrogen by capturing and digesting insects. The lower photograph here is of a bog, a type of wetland with sundew plants having trapped insects. The soil, as you can see, is waterlogged, experiencing low oxygen conditions, anaerobic conditions. In these conditions, nitrates are rapidly lost to the atmosphere by denitrifying bacteria that function well in low oxygen conditions. The nitrogen-poor soils are a selection pressure for the organisms that live there. Insectivorous plants are well adapted for the nutrient-poor soils as they supplement their requirement for nitrogen by capturing and digesting insects. So here's an IB syllabus statement that you should be able to answer. State the impact of waterlogging on the nitrogen cycle. The low oxygen condition of waterlogged soils accelerates nitrate loss from the soil. Denitrifying bacteria take advantage of the anaerobic conditions to transform nitrates to nitrogen gas, N2. Here we have nitrogen fixation by rhizobium bacteria associated with the roots of pea family plants, and here's denitrification by bacteria in waterlogged anaerobic soils. And here we have industrial fixation. This is the industrial application of fertilizers to our agricultural fields of the world. Remember that this IB essential idea is out in front of us. Soil cycles are subject to disruption. I've already touched on this idea earlier in this movie. Soil cycles are subject to disruption because people add nitrate fertilizers to agricultural fields, people remove crops and move the material elsewhere, thus nutrients are lost from the soil. Nitrates are leached from the soil during irrigation, and nitrates are lost from the soil when soils are anaerobic, low in oxygen, in a process known as denitrification. In agriculture, nitrogen compounds are used as fertilizers to stimulate productivity. In excess, fertilizers are pollutants, and this is a disruption of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. Harvesting plants removes nitrogen from the system and transfers it to other locations. This is a disruption in the soil nitrogen cycle. Deforestation. Harvesting trees removes nitrogen from the system and transfers it to other locations. As well, the runoff of water following deforestation accelerates leaching and nitrate loss from the system. Over-irrigating agricultural fields accelerates nitrate loss from the soil due to the waterlogged anaerobic conditions, the process known as denitrification. Over-irrigation increases the leaching of nitrates away from the soil region that's available to plants. So let's shift our attention to the phosphorus cycle. Here's the IB syllabus statement. Draw the phosphorus cycle displaying the following stocks of phosphorus: plants, animals, dead organic matter, inorganic soil phosphorus, and inorganic phosphorus in sediments. The phosphorus cycle is relatively easy without the complexity of the nitrogen cycle. The cycle is significantly less rapid than the nitrogen cycle, mostly because of the phosphorus that's locked up as inorganic phosphorus in the Earth's sediments. You can immediately see that the sediment storages of phosphorus are by far the largest. The phosphorus cycle, as it exists, is here, 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 and again, from the uptake of phosphate by producers to animals, to the decomposers, the cycling, is simple. With these fluxes, you can see that the deposition of significant amounts of phosphorus occurs into the sediment storages. One last thing, notice that there is no atmospheric stock of phosphorus, and there are no significant transformations of phosphorus in the soil as there are in the nitrogen cycle. Once again, the cycling of phosphorus is quite slow due to the large quantities of phosphorus locked up in the sediments and with no atmospheric stock of phosphorus. Phosphorus is taken up from the soil or from the water by producers. Organic phosphorus is moved to consumers, and then producers and consumers, upon death, are decomposed by decomposers. And it's all that simple, starting again with the uptake of phosphorus, phosphate in fact, by plants from water or soil. Phosphorus is deposited to the sediments, and erosion or the mining of phosphorus makes it available for use as a fertilizer. Here are two relevant IB syllabus statements. The rate of turnover in the phosphorus cycle is much slower than the nitrogen cycle. Phosphorus can be added to the phosphorus cycle by application of fertilizer or removed by the harvesting of agricultural crops. In this diagram of the phosphorus cycle, you must appreciate the loss of phosphorus to the sedimentary portion of the cycle. That phosphorus is locked up in the sediments and rocks results in a low rate of turnover. You can see the simple cycling in the ocean and on land. Uptake by the producers, from producers to consumers, and then to decomposers. Decomposers make phosphorus a critical nutrient available again to producers. But humans can harvest phosphate from mines and from locations where birds have left significant quantities of guano. Phosphate is used as a fertilizer. Interestingly, most phosphate fertilizers originate from mines. Thus, phosphate fertilizer is a non-renewable resource and must be managed carefully. Phosphorus can be added to the phosphorus cycle by the application of fertilizer, but most phosphate fertilizers come from mines, such as this one in the photograph. Thus, phosphate is a non-renewable resource. Its supply is limited. There are locations in the world where phosphate fertilizers originate with guano. The movement of phosphate from the ocean to the land by fish-eating birds can be significant, as seen in these images of the guano industry in Peru. Remember that the sedimentary portion of the phosphorus cycle slows the rate of turnover relative to nitrogen or carbon cycles, but it is the uplift of rocks that allows humans to mine phosphorus. As a mined mineral, it's a non-renewable resource. Phosphorus availability is limited and subject to potential shortages, but it is mined and used as a fertilizer to stimulate the productivity in agriculture. The runoff of phosphates into waterways presents a pollution problem. More on that later. Here are three IB syllabus statements with which you should feel comfortable. Phosphorus can be added to the phosphorus cycle by the application of fertilizer or removed by the harvesting of agricultural crops. The rate of turnover in the phosphorus cycle is much lower than in the nitrogen cycle, and the availability of phosphate may become limiting to agriculture in the future. Remember, nutrient cycles are subject to disruption. Thus, harvesting plants removes phosphorus from the system and transfers it to other locations. In agriculture, phosphorus compounds are used as fertilizers to stimulate productivity. In excess, fertilizers are pollutants. More on this later. Here are IB syllabus statements tightly related that I've been circling around throughout this movie. Soil cycles are subject to disruption. Describe one example of how humans interfere with nutrient cycling. I've spoken about the use of nitrogen fertilizers in agriculture as a disruption of the nitrogen cycle, and I've spoken about the harvesting of crops moved to distant markets as a loss of soil nitrogen. In this image, notice the leaching of nitrogen into waterways, rivers, lakes, and ocean. The over-fertilizing of agricultural land causes a pollution problem known as eutrophication. I've spoken about the use of phosphate fertilizers in agriculture as a disruption of the phosphorus cycle. And I've spoken about the harvesting of crops moved to distant markets as a loss of soil phosphorus. Notice the runoff of phosphorus into waterways, rivers, lakes, and ocean. The over-fertilizing of agricultural land causes a pollution problem called eutrophication. So that brings us to this IB syllabus statement. Leaching of mineral nutrients from agricultural land into rivers causes eutrophication and leads to increased biochemical oxygen demand, BOD. Let's look at eutrophication first, then I'll address biochemical oxygen demand, also known as BOD. Nitrates and phosphates run off and leach into waterways, stimulating an algal bloom. This is the first of a series of events in the process of eutrophication. In this photograph, you can see the algal bloom just off the coast of Florida. Here is another photograph of eutrophication, Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. Nitrates and phosphates from the over-application of fertilizers on agricultural fields initiates eutrophication, which causes an algal bloom, as can be seen here at the edges of the lake. But that's not where eutrophication ends. Stay tuned. So here is how eutrophication proceeds, and the end result is the death of aerobic organisms like fish. In the end, there is less diversity and less complex food webs. Fertilizers run off and leach into waterways. The nutrients stimulate algal growth. You could see that in the previous photographs. The algae die, and their decomposition by bacteria reduces oxygen levels in the water. The consumption of oxygen by bacteria is called biological oxygen demand. The algal bloom results in turbid water, dark water that reduces light penetration. Larger plants die, and fish die due to the low oxygen levels associated with the decomposition of the algae by the bacteria. Once again, the algae are stimulated by the runoff and the leaching of nitrogen and phosphorus into the aquatic system. When the algae die, the bacteria decompose the algae. The bacteria that decompose the algae consume oxygen. Oxygen is used in cell respiration of the bacteria. This is biological oxygen demand. A decline in oxygen levels results in fish death. There is a loss of diversity and really a loss of the habitat. Fertilizers with nitrates and phosphates, as well as detergents and sewage, all contribute to eutrophication. Here are two bodies of water that have undergone eutrophication. Fertilizers stimulated an algal bloom. Once the algae die, the decomposers bloom, and there's oxygen loss as the decomposers respirate the algae. And then, with the loss of oxygen, fish death. The consumption of oxygen by bacteria is called biological oxygen demand. Eutrophicated water becomes turbid, deep green, or even black. Light cannot penetrate. Macrophytes, the large aquatic plants, become covered in algae, and they struggle to obtain light. So here is eutrophication in outline. I'll let you stop the movie and study this slide on your own. So I would hope that you are comfortable with these IB syllabus statements, including eutrophication that leads to the increased biochemical oxygen demand, BOD. But let me strengthen biological oxygen demand. Biological or biochemical oxygen demand is defined as the amount of dissolved oxygen required by aerobic organisms to break down organic material present in a given water sample at a certain temperature over a specific time period. BOD can be measured using an apparatus seen here. Sample of water is taken, dissolved oxygen levels are recorded, a fixed mass of bacteria would be added, the bottle is sealed. 5 days later, dissolved oxygen levels are recorded again. BOD is a measure of the organic matter in the sample of water based on the amount of oxygen required by bacteria to break down the organic matter per liter of water over the 5-day period. Here are the units for BOD. So here is a chance to respond to some questions about polluted water and BOD. In this table, you can see the pollution emitted by 4 different sources. This left column is the volume of effluent per day, while this right column displays the BOD of the effluent in milligrams oxygen per liter per 5 days. And here are the questions. Which factory is adding the most polluted effluent? And then which factory is adding most to the total BOD of the river into which it discharges its pollution? I hope that you can see that source C is adding the most polluted effluent because its volume of effluent is relatively low, but its BOD is quite high. Source A is adding most to the BOD of the river because multiplying the volume of effluent by the BOD yields the highest product of any of the 4 sources of pollution. So at this point, could you define the term biochemical oxygen demand and state the cause of high BOD? And now that you know how to measure BOD, you know at least one way of investigating the effect of an environmental disturbance on an ecosystem. And lastly, I want to return to Gershmill diagrams to reinforce them and to make a connection to the cycling of the nutrients that I've covered in this movie. Here is the general Gershmill diagram. The storages are shown as circles, and their relative size displays the relative magnitude of each storage. The flows or the fluxes are shown as arrows, and their relative size indicates the magnitude of the flux. The storage of nutrients in the soil would be inorganic nutrients such as nitrates and phosphates. This storage does not represent available carbon. Plants take up their carbon from the air in the form of carbon dioxide. The storage of nutrients in the litter would be organic matter in or on the soil, including leaf litter and humus. Humus is partially decomposed organic matter. The storage of nutrients in biomass is the total dry mass of living organisms, plants mostly, per unit area. The uptake of nutrients from the soil to the plants represents the uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus. Nutrient inputs into ecosystems include nutrients dissolved in raindrops and nutrients from weathered rocks. The nutrients would be nitrates and phosphates. Remember that carbon, as carbon dioxide, comes into the living system from photosynthesis. Nutrient outputs from ecosystems includes nutrients lost through surface runoff and nutrients lost through leaching. The terms runoff and leaching should be clear to you now. The implications of nutrient runoff and leaching should also be clear in the eutrophication process. Here is a slide that you will want to spend some time studying. In the taiga biome, the litter nutrient storage is the largest storage, with conifer needles making up the large proportion of organic matter as litter. Nutrient cycling is generally slow due to the cold temperatures. In the desert biome, the soil nutrient storage is the largest. Nutrient flows are generally slow due to the scarcity of organisms given the dry conditions. In the rainforest biome, the largest storage of nutrients is found in the living organisms, plants mostly. The rate of nutrient cycling is fast due to the warm, wet conditions. The soil is nutrient poor as a result of the rapid uptake of nutrients by the plants. Here is another Gershmill diagram of the rainforest. Notice the large storage of nutrients found in the living organisms. This is biomass, plants mostly. The rate of nutrient cycling is fast due to the warm, wet conditions and the rapid decomposition of organisms by decomposers. The soil is nutrient poor as a result of the rapid uptake of nutrients by the plants. Now, this diagram also includes a flux or a flow called harvest. The loss of biomass due to human harvest is important to consider, as it represents a loss of nitrogen or phosphorus from the system. Human harvest is a disruption of nutrient cycling. And that brings us to the end of IB Bio, Ecology and Conservation, Option C, Part 10.